This is probably as careful a book review as I will ever make. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a review of The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. This is the second time this book has been gifted to me. Once it was by a student back when I was teaching, and the second time was by somebody that I love very much, is very close to me, who is a person of faith, who is a believer. And therefore, I decided that I would read it because this person had gifted it to me out of, their love and affection for me. And knowing that I'm not myself a person of faith, I'm not a believer, I'm not, a Christian, other than having been raised in, Judeo-Christian society, and therefore probably influenced by a lot of things, my habits. But I did decide to read it. So what this book is this book is essentially Lee Strobel, who is a lawyer and was the legal editor for a newspaper in Chicago. And he is a person of faith, essentially laying out the case to try to prove not only that Christ existed, but that Christ was the Son of God, God himself, resurrected, etc. In other words, he's trying to prove that Christ of religion is real. He's trying to make a case that, Jesus was indeed the Son of God, crucified, rose on the third day, appeared to his disciples, etc. That's the case that he's trying to make. So, I am, of course, skeptical about this. And, being a skeptic and being a non-believer, you probably, if you are a believer, your first reaction may be as well, of course, you're going to poke holes in the guy's case. You don't believe. I would just counter that by saying, if you do believe, you're going to buy into the guy's case because you do believe. And this gets to an issue that I have with the book, and I have with a lot of things like this that I'll talk about at the end. But before I do that, let me take the book on its own merits. It is easy to read. Strobel definitely talks to a lot of experts, a lot of people who are highly educated in teaching and publishing about Christianity from many different aspects of Christian faith. It definitely does his legwork. The book is easy to read. It's really well organized, and he makes what he believes to be a strong case. Now, from my point of view, I don't have a problem believing that a man named Jesus lived, that he attracted a group of followers who were promoting a different version of Judaism, in which, this Jesus person was the Messiah, that, he lived, that he taught, that he created problems within Jewish community in Roman Judea, that he was vilified, that he was crucified, and that from his teachings and from what he said, the Christian faith was developed, centered around him and his teachings. I don't have a problem believing any of that. I'm not skeptical about the existence of Jesus or about the things he taught. I'm not going to take issue with whether or not Jesus said the things in the Bible that the authors of the gospel say that he said. I'm not going to look at that. I'm not going to take issue with whether or not Jesus was resurrected, or whether or not the tomb was found empty, or whether or not he was crucified. And these are all issues that Strobel goes into in the book. And I'm not going to take issue and really look at any of those things, because to me, the foundation of the case that he's making, the argument he's making, is where the weakness lies. So the problem with making the case that beyond the idea that Jesus lived and taught and developed and attracted disciples who believed he was the Messiah and established a church based on his teaching, like I said, I think all of that is probably historically provable, and lots of that evidence is here in the book. But there's a big step between that and the idea that Jesus was actually the Son of God, or God, however you want to look at the role of Jesus. That's not something I want to debate with you here either. But the problem with that is that if we're talking about the divinity of Jesus, we're talking about Jesus being the Son of God, being the actual Messiah, having the ability to perform miracles, the only sources for that are the Gospels, and maybe some of the things that Paul wrote. So the entire case for Christ, the entire book is based on whether or not we accept the Gospels as historical documents, as historically accurate. And again, the Gospels exist. They're very old books. At worst, the oldest of the Gospels dates to maybe 20 to 30 years after the death after the crucifixion of Jesus. They are old books, and they have been around for some time. So I'm not going to debate necessarily their authenticity as being really old books. But if they're the only sources we have for the idea that Jesus was the Son of God, if they're the only sources we have that say that Jesus actually performed miracles, then that becomes a problem, because obviously the Gospels were written by people who were believers in Jesus, and they were written to promote and preserve the stories of Jesus, and they were written to promote and preserve the idea of Jesus' divinity. Those are not unbiased sources. And beyond that, there are some issues with the Gospels themselves as historical documents. To begin with, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That is not the order the Gospels were written in. The oldest of the Gospels is the Gospel of Mark. And interestingly, Mark ends with the crucifixion and does not contain stories of the resurrection. It is the oldest. But Mark was not one of Jesus' disciples. Mark apparently wrote the Gospel of Mark while living in Rome, and he wrote the stories that were related to him by Peter. So notice something about the Gospel of Mark. It's not written by an eyewitness. He is, if we take everything as at face value, he has apparently interviewed and talked to Peter, and that therefore he is essentially recording the firsthand accounts of an actual eyewitness. If this person named Mark is actually the author of the book. And there is an if there. Tradition tells us that this person named Mark wrote the book and he had this relationship with Peter. That is Christian tradition. That is the tradition. But tradition is not proof. It's just something that's accepted among believers. It's something that believers accept to be true. So Mark is the oldest. The next two Gospels are Matthew and Luke. Matthew was a disciple, and so we could look at his gospel as a first-hand account written some 30 years or so after the death of Jesus. Clearly, Matthew was influenced by the Gospel of Mark. Clearly, whoever wrote Matthew had read the Gospel of Mark. Luke is the third of the Gospels, and Luke, again, was not one of the disciples himself. He was an associate of Paul, who comes along later, and I'll talk about him in just a minute. He was an associate of Paul who, according to Luke, Paul had met with the disciples and learned about Jesus from them, and Luke is recording his version, or that version, of the life of Jesus there. And the fourth gospel is John. John is the one that matches up the least with the other three, and John, tradition tells us, was written by a disciple of Jesus. So looking at those four sources as a historian, even if we accept that the authors were actually these people, named that Matthew was Matthew, Mark was Mark, Luke, John, etc., we are still looking at, documents or sources recorded by people who were close to Jesus, who are believers and had a reason to want to promote this belief in the idea of Jesus' divinity. At worst, we can say that there is no clear authorship of any of the Gospels, that tradition tells us they were written by these people, and that tradition is really old, but that, it isn't really provable. In addition to that, it is clear that Matthew and Luke were influenced by a group or a set of writings or sayings that has been lost to history, which is referred to by biblical historians, as Q. This kind of collection of sayings and stories about Jesus that don't make up a narrative, but that they say influenced Matthew and Luke. What they're saying is that because Matthew and Luke have these stories in them that are not in Mark, and are not, therefore they must have gotten from somewhere. There must be the source named Q. Notice how, we can't prove that this source named Q existed other than by inference. This is in of itself problematic. Authorship is problematic. The bias of the potential authors is problematic, even if we accept that these are the people who actually wrote them. In addition to that, the time in which the Gospels were written, they're not written during Jesus' life. They're not even written necessarily immediately after Jesus' life or after his crucifixion, and therefore there is a time gap, which, to me as a historian, that, presents a problem. Only two of them at best are actually written by eyewitnesses. And again, quite a long time after the fact. The Gospels themselves don't always agree. It's not necessarily that I'm going to go out and say they contradict, but they don't agree on all the stories. They don't agree on everything. As I mentioned to you, Mark doesn't contain, I don't think, stories of resurrection, or at least what happens after the resurrection. Matthew and Luke do. John has the most stories about Jesus after the resurrection of all of them. And so, they don't all say the same things. So, if I accept that the Bible is the Word of God, heavenly, divinely inspired Word of God that was written by these men, essentially channeling the Word of God, then my first question would be, why don't they match up? Why aren't they the same? Shouldn't they be the same? Shouldn't they say the same thing? Shouldn't they remove all doubt if they are indeed inspired by God? Why would be these differences? Why would there be these discrepancies? One of the things that Strobel goes to a lot of trouble to try to prove is that the Gospels, as historical texts, are as believable and as accurate and as valid as any ancient text. And I won't argue with him about that. I won't argue that what is in the Gospels might not be as accurate as what is in Herodotus, or what is in the work of a Roman official who recorded events taking place during the reign of Herod, that they may be as accurate as that. But first of all, those documents are not all that accurate. And second, nobody lives their life, nobody bases their salvation or the laws that they believe should be passed, or the politicians they should follow, or the rules they think society should follow. They don't base that on Herodotus. They don't base that on these other old texts. So, to me, the gospel should be absolutely ironclad proof and ironclad sources if we're going to base society, religion, faith, our ideas of salvation on them. And the truth of the matter is, they're just not. And you can call that, atheist nitpick if you want to. That's fine. But I'm not the one who's making the case. I'm the one poking holes in the case that someone else made. In addition to that, one of the arguments that, people like me would make about the Gospels, particularly about this gap in time, this 20 to 30 years, where the Gospels are written after the death of Jesus. One of the things that atheists would say is, the authors then clearly are writing after the fact, and their intention is to create this story of a divine Jesus, and their intention is to promote this religion. And therefore, they would include things like miracles, etc., that are myths, because of the time period that would have been important towards gathering followers and towards building the religion. Strobel answers that by saying, essentially, that there wasn't time for these myths to develop. That even though there is this, 1 or 2 or 3 decade gap between the death of Jesus and the writing of the Gospels, that's not enough time for myths to be built. And as a historian, I can tell you that's just not true. Wasn't true then, and it's not true now. Myths develop really quickly. Myths about important, powerful, popular people develop really, really quickly. Just to give you one example from American history, George Washington, there are all kinds of myths about George Washington. Wooden teeth, cannot tell a lie, cut down the cherry tree, threw $1 across the Potomac River. These are myths, and those myths were created by Washington's very first biographer, who literally began writing his biography the year after, or the year that George Washington died. His name was Parson Weems, and his biography of Washington, because Washington was so great and revered, his biography of Washington became essentially the source about Washington for decades, and it became something that people just believed about George Washington. And this is something that happened almost immediately. The exact same thing is true about Davy Crockett. A lot of the stories about Davy Crockett, killing a bear and doing all these things, those are myths about Davy Crockett, in the 1830s, 1840s, that were in existence, myths and about him during his lifetime. He was still alive when those myths were told. You can even take that to Babe Ruth. And did Babe Ruth call a shot, point and hit a home run, yes or no? And even the idea a lot of people have with Donald Trump, that he's a self-made billionaire, that the economy under Trump was better than at any other time in American history. These are in fact myths that came into existence, even in our day of information, that came to existence immediately, that come to existence really quickly. So the idea that there wasn't time for the authors of the Gospels, whoever they were, to build up this mythology, to record this mythology intentionally about Jesus, to make Jesus a more popular, powerful figure, that doesn't hold with a historical record. That kind of thing happens quite frequently, and is not all that unusual. So for me, the problem with the case for Christ is that it fails in its initial effort to establish that the Gospels are absolute accurate. And if you can't establish the Gospels are absolutely accurate, they're absolutely true, that everything in them is literally true, then you cannot establish the divinity of Jesus. You cannot establish that Jesus was the Son of God, that he rose from the dead, that he is the path to salvation. And one of the things, and this is what I want to get to here at the end, the thing that bothers me the most about books like The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel and other people trying to prove the existence of God is that it seems to me to be counterintuitive. If you can prove that God exists, if you could prove 100% that the God of the Bible, the Christian God, exists, there's no longer any reason for faith. People would believe simply because it was true. They would believe because they could see it, because it was absolute proof. Now, people of faith believe that it's in that absolute proof. But if you were able to convince all the non-believers that there was ironclad 100% proof, there would no longer be a reason for faith. And without this reason for faith, a lot of the religious system in Christianity would break down and would become unnecessary because people would just believe it because they could see that it was true. So, one of the things that then bothers me about this is, why is Strobel trying to do this? This is not evangelism, I think, in a way that is effective. It's not evangelism that will work to the benefit of the Christian church or Christian religion. It's evangelism that really attempts to remove the mystery of faith. And if you remove that mystery from faith, I think Christianity loses something. It loses something beautiful. It loses something special. Something that I don't have, I'm never going to have. But, that doesn't mean I don't appreciate that it can exist in others and that can move and motivate them to do great things and very good things. Okay? I just think that other things can move and motivate people to do great things and very good things as well. Anyway, there you go. There's my review and rant about The Case for Christ. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below. As always, thank you for watching.